want to thank you all. I'm John LaRue with the United Chamber, and this is our infrastructure committee, which is one of the major committees that we have. And really now in the last 2 months, we've taken a look at two of the major issues of infrastructure for the region. The last one we did was on the new bridge and where that was going, and now desal. And with COVID-19, a lot of these issues have gotten pushed to the back burner where they do not belong. Those two, and this one especially, are crucial issues for the future of our region. Water supply, along with electricity and other demands for infrastructure, transportation, highways, rail are crucial for our future. So we view this as a major part of what the Chamber should be doing, is advocacy and providing information to the business community. And when I say business community, I don't just mean our members, I mean that very broadly, so that everybody can understand what the issues are. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think this is an opportunity to set the record on the right course. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah and let her run with it a bit. And as we said, we've got some people on this call who were not necessarily on the agenda, but have a lot of information about this. And if they want to raise their hand and make a comment, we'd be more than glad to open the door for that. So Leah, go ahead.
Good morning. This feels like old home week. It's great to be here. The topic today is the City of Corpus Christi Seawater Desalination Project. And so we're concentrated on the projects of the city and not anybody else's projects. This is a little different. We've been using Zoom meetings, so just a little bit different format. What we like to try to do is, maybe Jason will go over the rules, but we want to give everybody a total opportunity to participate, but we kind of tried to organize it in a way that we can also capture easily your questions or comments. Anyway, with that, I'll say welcome again, and I'd like to turn it over to Jason Conklin, who is the project manager for this project for Freeze and Nichols. Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Leah, and good morning, everybody. We'll start by saying, we'd much prefer to be doing this in person, and we hope to be able to do these in person in the near future. We hope everyone is staying healthy and well. But for this virtual platform, there's a lot of ways to do this, and as Leah mentioned earlier, this is the third go-round for us this week. But in a group like this, we really want it to be collaborative. Like Mr. LaRue said, if anyone has anything to contribute, we'd be happy to just have that conversation. However, during the presentation, feel free to submit written questions using the chat. That not only helps us to track those questions and make sure that we can understand and respond, but that also gives you, the attendees, the opportunity to record those questions as we go. And that way, hopefully we'll be able to have that conversation and make this a little more collaborative. And then at the end of the presentation, obviously it'll be more open forum style, and as time permits, we can open things up. So this morning we have 4 presenters or panelists that you're going to hear from. Most of you probably know Leah. She's leading the outreach and communications efforts for the Desalination Initiative for the city and the Freeze and Nichols team. Leah has been a part of the desal conversation in the Coastal Bend for quite some time and is familiar with all of the complexities and dynamics and issues. So we're really grateful to have Leah leading the outreach and communications efforts for us. On the city side, we have Esteban Ramos. Steve served as a former TCEQ water master for South Texas. Steve is very familiar with water supply in South Texas, and currently he manages the Corpus Christi water supply as the water supply manager for the city. Steve today is going to be presenting on water supply, the complexities of the city's current system, and then how we need to develop supplies to meet needs in the future. And Steve's also going to be talking about the project costs and project financing. Third, we have Dave Buzan. Dave is a very experienced aquatic ecologist. He specializes in all coastal issues and led the TCEQ's biological monitoring across Texas. He served as the manager of the Coastal Conservation Branch for Texas Parks and Wildlife for 14 years and was focused on coastal habitat restoration and ecology. So Dave today is going to be presenting on ecosystem mapping, species salinity tolerances, and some of the implications and considerations that we've had for the desal project on our very unique and special marine environment here in the Coastal Bend. My name is Jason Coughlin. I'm the project manager and a board certified environmental engineer. I live here in Corpus Christi, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to share about this project with you today. Our bench for the project team is pretty deep, and I could probably spend the next hour or so going over just the incredible experience and expertise that we have brought together for this really important initiative for the Coastal Bend. I'll highlight just a few of these team members here. I won't go into detail on everybody, but Mr. Vuchkov, pictured in the top left here, is a global desal technologist. I have a stack of technical references and manuals on seawater desalination on my desk, and Nikolai has written all but one of those. We joke on the team that he invented desalination. Obviously, he didn't spin around for quite some time, but Mr. Vuchkov is absolutely a world-renowned expert and brings a lot of expertise to the team. Jorge Arroyo, similarly, led the Texas Water Development Board Innovative Water Technologies Group for 10 years at the state level. Jorge is very familiar with innovative water technologies and alternative water supplies. He's been leading efforts across Texas for about 20 years, developing alternative water supplies. And he won't be presenting today. I'll be covering his slides, but Jorge is just an incredible asset to the team and the project. Mike Morrison on the top right has about 50 years of experience in water treatment in Texas. He has worked really closely with TCEQ to actually write a lot of the regulations for public water systems in Texas. And then finally, I'll highlight Dr. Toe here in the bottom right. Dr. Toe is a modeler by trade. He has a PhD in modeling, and actually his dissertation was done on modeling the dispersion of concentrate from seawater desalination systems. So Dr. Toe is leading all the modeling efforts, including incorporating some really interesting data that we've been able to collect, and we're going to talk about a little bit later. Our outline is relatively straightforward. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but I'll just highlight here the 3 yellow lines are where we have typically been breaking for questions. If along the way you want to submit a question in writing using the chat, feel free. Leah, I think, is going to be monitoring those chat questions. And then obviously when we get to the end, we'd be happy to answer any additional questions. So we'll start here by talking about the Coastal Bend water supply and how we can meet future demands.
Okay, Jason, thank you. First, on behalf of the City of Corpus Christi, I would like to thank you for giving this opportunity to come and give y'all an update on our project, highlight the benefits and the situation that is in our area. I'm pretty sure everybody's familiar with our water supplies in this area. The City of Corpus Christi is a wholesale water provider for the region. We service nearly approximately 500,000 people in the Coastal Bend. We have 4 sources of water. 2 sources are from the Nueces River. These sources are the Lake Corpus Christi and Choke Canyon reservoirs. We also have 2 other water supplies from the Lavaca Navidad River Authority out of Lake Texana through a contract. And then we also have farther east is our Colorado water rights from the Colorado River near Bay City. Each of these water supplies have a unique history and characteristic amongst themselves. They provide our area with the needed water that services the Coastal Bend and its community. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little about water demand. The water demand in our region continues to grow. Our region is different than most areas in Texas, where we see large step increases in water demands over time. The blue area represents current and future water demands. The black line represents our firm yield. The firm yield represents the total amount of water from our current water supplies that can be used in the worst drought of record. At the end of the black line, you can see that we've added a new water supply. I wanted to point that out. Yellow line represents 75% of that firm yield. Over time, you can see that it has changed. This is due to recall in contract water from Lake Texana, the silting of Choke Canyon and Lake Corpus Christi, and the new drought of record in the Nueces River Basin and in Colorado River Basin. These factors led to the drop in our firm yield. Our region demand is on the rise as shown in the blue. It will meet or exceed the 75% of firm yield in the 2022-2023 timeframe, which the City Council has set as a trigger point for a new water supply. In order to meet these known demand increases, the city has looked at alternative water supplies, including seawater desalination. Seawater desalination provides a drought-resistant water supply that could lead our community into the future. By adding this supply, we can increase the firm yield, and as you can see in the 2025 timeline on the graph. Our demands are changing, and we need to prepare for our future demands. Jason, I'll turn it back over to you.
Now we'd like to take the chance and just give a real quick introduction to the seawater desalination process, project implementation, some of the technologies, and then some updates on the specific project itself, many of which you're probably familiar with. This is an illustrative diagram. This is not necessarily, exactly what will be implemented here in the Coastal Bend as we move forward in implementing the project, but it's a really good representation of the general process that's used in large-scale seawater desalination plants around the globe. I'm not going to go into every detail here, but I'll highlight a few things, particularly 4 process streams that are important to talk about when you talk about a seawater desalination process, and the 2 segments of treatment. Before you get to actually removing the salts from the water, you have really a conventional treatment process. So just like you would see at O.N. Stevens or one of Sampat Municipal Water District's conventional plants, where it's a typical surface water treatment, removing the sediment, silt, in this case, potentially algae, and other solids that would be in the water. So when the raw water comes in, it goes through, like I said, a more conventional pretreatment process to remove those things, so that what goes to the reverse osmosis membranes is already really very clean. In this first pretreatment process, when we remove all those solids, those are actually dewatered and then taken to a landfill. So those solids, the silt, sediment, algae, and other things won't be returned to the receiving water body. And that's what we call residuals, if you can see this here. I know it's a little bit small. After pretreatment, we'll go into the heart of the desalination system, which is really just removing the total dissolved solids. So the pretreatment is for removing suspended solids, particulates, and things. Reverse osmosis is actually a tight enough membrane that it can remove what's dissolved, salts, minerals, and things like that. What comes out of the reverse osmosis is 2 streams. One is very clean water. We call that permeate because it permeates the membrane. That permeate will be stabilized and disinfected to potable standards and then introduced into the cities, or in the case of Sampat Municipal Water District, the SPMWD's potable distribution system. That's an important part of implementing this project in a cost-effective manner, is being able to leverage the existing potable distribution systems. The second stream that comes out of the RO is the concentrate. So as you remove the clean water, the permeate, you have a highly concentrated salt stream. We call that concentrate, and it's about 2 times the concentration of the water that we bring in relative to total dissolved solids. So if the water in the bay is about 35 parts per thousand, salt, what we put back is between 60 and 70 parts per thousand. The recovery rate on the system is between 40 and 50%. So we take that concentrate and disperse it using jet diffusion, which is something we'll talk about a little later. And the fourth stream that's not pictured here is a cleaning stream that's done about once a year called clean in place. That's done with very strong acids and bases. But those chemicals are always captured and neutralized and either disposed of in a local sanitary sewer or hauled off for disposal at an appropriate site. So again, those four streams are the raw water that comes into the plant. This is just bay water. The residuals or solids that are taken to a landfill. The permeate that's cleaned and used as potable water in the existing distribution systems. And then the concentrate, which looks just like a bottle of water. It's crystal clear, just very salty, that's going to be diffused back into the receiving water bodies. Globally, there's over 26 billion gallons of desalination capacity installed. So although this is a relatively new technology on the seawater side for Texas, there's a lot of brackish groundwater desal done in Texas. Globally, it's a very well studied and understood process. For this specific project, and I see several folks online here who have been involved even before the 2014 phase 1 began. We started looking at this in detail, developing a technical and economic feasibility study, followed by the development of a project prototype. And we also partnered with the Hart Research Institute to look at siting and intake and discharge. In phase 2, we helped to define the project, really honing in on locations and capacities. We determined those locations through an exhaustive project siting process, which we'll talk about. We entered into the permitting phase, submitting 4 permit applications to the state. And we've also been doing a lot of outreach. The next phase, phase 3, will be procurement, which is actually going out to the market and procuring a contractor to design and build the plant, financial closing, and then the design, construction, and commissioning. The 2 projects are defined here in the chart, specifically with capacities, and we define these as initial, expandable, and ultimate. And this is the basis of the permit applications that have been submitted to the state. The capacities, we call this average daily production. So this is actually the potable water production from the plant. Initial just means what the plant will be able to produce on day 1. Expandable means that we'll actually design and build some of the assets to be able to handle a larger capacity so that it can be expanded to meet that capacity very efficiently. And then the ultimate would be the long-term, excuse me, the long-term ultimate capacity that the permit would allow. I mentioned the plant siting being one of the most critical elements of this process. Dr. McKinney at the Hart Research Institute, in his testimony to the Natural Resources Committee at the state, mentioned that desal is just like real estate. It's all about location. So the city has been very, very proactive in their approach to location. We started with 19 potential sites around the region. We screened those using the parameters you see here, arrived at 4 candidate sites, which we knew had the characteristics of a good site, but we wanted to make sure that we landed on 2 that would be both permittable, sustainable, and meet all of the evaluation parameters that are defined here. Those 2 preferred sites were identified on the La Quinta Channel and the Inner Harbor Ship Channel. Leah, I don't know if we've had any questions come in, but we'll take a minute here if anyone has questions at this point.
No, so far, the only thing I wanted to mention is I chatted to everyone. Someone reported that the texts were floating around. So if anyone else has that problem, could you raise your hand, please? I wanted to recognize some people, if I could, for a second while we're seeing if there's questions. So I first started working on this with the city back in the 1980s when I was there. Carl Hurl, I think, is on the phone. May remember that effort during a rather severe drought. Since that point, it's come back 2 or 3 times, and I've worked on projects. And I noticed that Angie Flores is on the phone. I know that this has been seawater desalination has been a critical interest for Chairman Hunter for a decade. So I wanted to recognize their efforts. And then Mark Scott, I believe, was on the council, hi Mark, when this was first brought back by a stakeholders group that was funded by the EDC, and we have people from the EDC, CCR EDC on the phone, as well as Port Industries. And I see Bob Paulson, Ken Griffin, Darcy Schroeder, and partnering throughout that with us has been Brian Williams and the San Patricio Municipal Water District partnering with the city. So I just want to recognize that, and I think we've done 2 or 3 different sessions previously since this began. Bob probably remembers presenting to the infrastructure committee. So for some of y'all, this is not new, but it has developed over the last, as we moved through permitting, development, and site selection. Any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any, so let's push on.
All right, thank you. Second to siting, and really a component of siting, one of the very heavily weighted considerations that we have to evaluate for seawater desalination are relative to the intake and the discharge. So we really wanted to key in on this today.
Thank you, Jason. This is Dave Buzan, and thank you for the opportunity to meet with you today. One of the things we did in evaluating site locations was look at the presence of what is generally considered important habitat for estuarine organisms, the presence of seagrass, and the presence of oysters. We looked initially at 2 sites in the La Quinta Channel and 3 locations in the Inner Harbor. And as you may imagine, there were seagrass identified in the La Quinta Channel locations, no seagrass in the Inner Harbor locations. None of the locations impact known oyster reefs that are in the system. We also looked at the possible presence of designated critical habitat for federally listed threatened and endangered species. And the only designated critical habitat is there near Indian Point, and that's a designated critical habitat for federally threatened piping plovers. One of the things that we do recognize is that in the Inner Harbor, for example, there is a lot of what we would call hardened shorelines with bulkheads, and we understand that organisms utilize those habitats as well. Next slide, please. We know that there are going to be valid concerns about impingement and entrainment of aquatic organisms into the system. And impingement means organisms being sucked up against the screens that are protecting the intake. Entrainment refers to very small organisms that are getting sucked into past the screen into the intake. We plan to use wedge wire screens. These are 2 to 3 millimeters wide. Generally, smaller than a lot of the larval organisms that may be expected to occur in the area. We also will be utilizing low inlet velocities, and these are less than 0.5 feet per second. So a lot of aquatic organisms will be able to avoid these low velocities and avoid impingement and entrainment. These intake structures will be located at depth away from the shoreline, so they should be in areas that are avoiding the higher concentrations of aquatic organisms. And one thing I'd point out is that the wedge wire screens and the low intake velocities are considered best technologies available for minimizing impingement and entrainment. Thank you, Jason.
In addition to targeting the areas that are, like Dave said, lower in concentration for marine organisms, we also need to look at the implications of the intake installation on water quality for the process. So fortunately, there are a lot of synergies between those two considerations. When we look for water quality, we're not just looking for good water quality, we really want to target stable water quality. Any membrane system like stable operations. So that's, continuously running at capacity with stable feed water quality. And so the target here for our team was to go out and implement a water sampling protocol that evaluated not just water quality over time, but also at profiles across the water column. So we went out and we sampled at multiple points in the water column for multiple sampling events, and we're able to develop some profiles to target a sufficient depth where we could achieve the stable water quality with really optimal characteristics with respect to TDS, turbidities, and total suspended solids. As part of this, we also evaluated the impacts of ship traffic in both of these locations to see if a large ship passing by would cause turbidity or TSS spikes. And what we found was that the optimal depth for almost all of these things is between 15 and 20 feet. That also gives us sufficient depth to reduce any impacts or mitigate risks from spills in the water bodies. And we understand that in the coastal bend, our seagrasses grow at less than 6 feet of depth because they need sunlight. And so our intake location also avoids interference with a lot of ecosystems that require seagrasses because we'll have sufficient depth for that. Moving on to the discharge. Another area that we could probably spend the full 2 hours talking about, but we'll highlight some really unique things here that the city's project team has done, particularly on permitting requirements for a discharge. What the state requires is that you disperse the concentrate to certain dilutions at 3 different mixing zones. Those mixing zones are defined by the state: 50 feet, 200 feet, and 400 feet. So our target, just to meet the permit criteria, would be to model the dispersion of the concentrate, and that's using jet diffusion, as noted here, basically just mixing velocity and energy to disperse that concentrate back to near ambient in those 3 mixing zones. And in addition to the permitting requirements on modeling, once the plant is implemented, there are a lot of requirements associated with monitoring the discharge. So that's monitoring the quality of the concentrate itself, but also monitoring the ability of the jet diffusion system to disperse the concentrate back to those salinities that you've committed to in the permit. TCEQ says that as part of the modeling, we would be allowed to assume a certain ambient velocity in the water body. Now, that assumption is one that's used in a lot of lakes or reservoirs that have wastewater discharges. And those are systems that have a lot fewer dynamics than maybe our system here has. We understand that our ecosystem and our relatively shallow basin estuary system have a lot of dynamics that aren't well understood. So one of the things that the city's team and our team have been able to do is partner with the Texas Water Development Board and borrow 2 of these instruments you see on the right. This instrument is called an acoustic Doppler current profiler. for me, this is really one of the most exciting parts of the project so far, is that we were able to install these instruments in both of the discharge locations, one on the La Quinta Channel and one on the Inner Harbor. And what this instrument does is evaluate currents, velocities, and flow rates over time in a specific location. So the La Quinta Channel instrument was installed for 6 months and was recently removed. The Inner Harbor instrument is still installed. It was installed a little bit after the La Quinta Channel instrument, so we're targeting 6 months of data there. And what we found was actually a little bit surprising. You know, we often hear locally that that our bay system is labeled a closed system, and in addition, we've heard that the La Quinta Channel is often called a closed system. But what we found over 6 months of data collection was that we see a very consistent unidirectional flow in the La Quinta Channel. So we have an ambient velocity that's moving in one direction, and that you know, that considers we've removed tidal exchange and other noise from the data. So what that shows is building into our modeling for the near field and far field approach, that if you draw a line across the La Quinta Channel where the discharge will be, what we found, thanks to that ambient velocity, is that 1.4 billion gallons of water a day would cross that line. And this isn't just back and forth tidal exchange, this is unidirectional flow. And we understand that some of the work that UTMSI has done also show that the bay currents tend to influence this. So this is a west to east flow, and some really interesting data that we were able to develop here in partnership with the Texas Water Development Board. Now what that does for our modeling, and I'll try not to get too far into the weeds here, I apologize, is that we look at those near field 3 mixing zones and make sure that we can meet the diffusion of the concentrate in those mixing zones. But the other thing we want to do, and this isn't required by the state, but the city has been very proactive in going above and beyond, is we want to make sure that in the far field, outside of those 3 mixing zones, outside of even the La Quinta Channel and into the larger bay system, that there aren't impacts of accumulation or salinity trends that would be unsustainable. So we've taken the near field approach using this ADCP, and then also used other modeling approaches to look at the far field and potential accumulations in the bay. We'll talk about that in depth quite a bit later. We also wanted to look at temperature, so we've modeled the process to see that the discharge temperature will only be 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient, which means if we take in bay water at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, the discharge would be about 81.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And that heat comes from pump inefficiencies, friction in the piping, and other things. There's no heat as part of this desal process. It's just energy inefficiencies that would contribute to that heat.
One of the things we were asked to do was to look at the salinity tolerances of the different types of ecologically, commercially, and recreationally important species that may be found in the area. And as we know, these are estuarine species, and as estuarine species, they have evolved and adapted to tolerate a fairly wide range of salinity, because sometimes the estuary is very fresh, and sometimes it's hypersaline. And so if you look at 3 different organisms that are considered important both to us socially and ecologically, blue crabs tolerate a range of salinity, and you can see that adults tolerate up to less than 10 to 33 parts per thousand, and with a maximum known of 67 parts per thousand. Spotted sea trout, we see maximum tolerable salinity of 45 parts per thousand. And red drum, another important recreational species, adults and juveniles tolerate up to 50 parts per thousand. So these salinities are, the tolerances are well within the range of salinities that are expected to be encountered around the intake and discharge of the desal facility.
So in the near field, this is what I talked about earlier, the 3 mixing zones, 50 feet, 200 feet, and 400 feet. So the desal plant will be required to achieve certain dilutions at each of those mixing zones. And this is related to aquatic health, but then also impacts potentially on the intake. Obviously, we don't want to create a loop of salinity here where what we discharge we're then taking in, and we have to increase the energy in the plant to maintain recovery. So that's critical for the near field, and this picture on the right is an example of a jet diffusion system. So essentially a pipe header with jets on it that actually eject the concentrate at about 8 feet per second. And that velocity is also diffused very quickly. If you've ever seen a bullet fired into water, water is an excellent receiver of energy and helps to dissipate that. So we've modeled both the dispersion of the concentrate, but then also potential impacts of the velocity, because we understand the nature of both of these channels being heavy marine traffic and shipping. So let's take a look at Corpus Christi Bay. The bay itself is actually 282 billion gallons, and this is an estimate that comes out of some studies that were done by the Texas Water Development Board. It is an interesting system. Like I mentioned earlier, relatively shallow. We're an inshore environment where we have the barrier islands, and this creates a unique circumstance for us. But there are some dynamics that we want to highlight here. As far as inflows to our bay system, we obviously have precipitation and then the storm water that would come with the precipitation over land. We have surface waters or rivers that come into our systems, tidal exchange, and so this is the tidal exchange with the Gulf as we have ebb tides and then tides coming in. And then we also have the municipal and industrial discharges. Now, without getting too much into detail on the discharges, one of the really interesting things from my perspective about our system is that because the city has been proactive enough to go to other river basins to get surface water supplies for the region, we actually import fresh water from the Colorado River and Lake Texana that would not normally be a part of our watershed to come into our bays and estuaries. So that's a unique aspect of our municipal and industrial discharges, because that water is used by our residents, our commercial users, and large volume users, and then discharged as relatively fresh water into our bay systems. We also have some outflows. What we have seen in models of the bay is that there's a pretty consistent outflow to the ocean, and that's independent of the tidal exchange. So there's a net outflow. We also know that evaporation is an incredible force for our bay. At one point, Brian Williams and I had talked about equating the evaporative capacity of the bay to desal capacity, and I can't remember that number, but Brian may have that off the top of his head. He seems to have a better memory than I do. But evaporation is a very, very significant dynamic for the bay. And then the tidal exchange again on both sides for inflow and outflow. Dave mentioned the salinity tolerances for our species in the area. And one of the reasons that's important is because naturally the inshore system in the coastal bend area swings pretty widely relative to salinity. And this is based on the fact that that we have barrier islands, we're an inshore system, but also relatively shallow. So you can see that with very heavy precipitation, or on the converse, significant periods of drought, the salinity variations in our bay can be pretty significant, really between 25 and up to 42 or 45 parts per thousand TDS. So if you consider that and try to keep that in your mind, we'll recall this information a little later. Now, we do benefit from the fact that the TCEQ has decades and decades of data from surface water quality monitoring stations across the bay. These are all available on their website. This specific station, 13407, is right in the middle of Corpus Christi Bay, and they have data going back to 1988 on this system. So I'm going to leave this up here for just a second. I don't know if everyone can see the axis on the left, but I'll highlight here real quick. Oh, I may not have annotating powers. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Anyway, here's 24. And so you'll see the majority of the data points here between about 24 and 40. which is a 16 part per thousand range. Looking at the bay, almost like a bathtub, we have some inflows and outflows. Each of these we talked about. The models on the bay and the bay system have shown that the average outflow is about 552 million gallons a day. And this is net outflow independent of tidal exchange. And then the exchange itself is about 3.3 billion gallons a day. If we add a seawater desalination plant to the system, you see this on the lower left, we add a few more process streams here. We're going to be taking in the bay water. We'll return concentrate. And again, I mentioned earlier, that's about 2 times as salty as the bay water we take in. But then we provide potable water to the city, the commercial users, the large volume users, and those will go back in with the discharges. Now, this capture rate on the discharges is not 100%. We understand that. But there is what we call a return flow. So essentially, if you look at your concentrate plus the return flow on the water balance, the entire system, and this is the far field model, you do get some benefit from those return flows. Now, our far field modeling is shown here to be very simple. It's actually pretty complex, but what we do is we take into account all of those dynamics, the evaporation, the turnover in the bay. We understand that the bay turns over about every 1.4 years. So there's new water in the bay about every 1.4 years, and that has to do with the tidal exchange, the inflows, but then also that net outflow to the bay, in that the entire bay is exchanged in 1.4 years. So if we look at the far field model, and this is for the entire bay system, what you see on the y-axis here is desal production. The target capacity ultimate for the Inner Harbor plant is about 30 million gallons a day. So if we look at just 30 million gallons a day of desal production and take this across to see the increase in bay salinity, and this is steady state increase, so we ran this model out into perpetuity, and eventually you come to a steady state, we would see just a 0.3 of a part per thousand increase in the bay. And if you work up this y-axis, you can see if we were at ultimate capacity for both plants, which would be 70 million gallons a day, you can take that out and you're about 0.6 of a part per thousand increase in the bay. Now, the blue line is not considering those return flows I talked about. So if you do consider the return flows that you get, then you're actually at about 0.1 of a part per thousand at 30 million gallons a day, and 0.3 of a part per thousand at 70 million gallons a day. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier, the natural swings in salinity in our bay system is about 16 parts per thousand, and we're talking about 0.1 of a part per thousand, all the way up to 0.6 of a part per thousand, relative to the natural swings, which would be 16 parts per thousand. Or shown here, 17. Sometimes we like to round. We'll take another break here for questions. I don't see any coming through written, but I would say, Leah, if folks would like to unmute, they could also ask questions that way.
Sure. Does anybody want to raise their hand and have a question, or you ready to push onward so we can maybe get you out of here? Any hands? I don't see any. So let's move on. They're saving themselves from the end. The only thing I would add is there's a few people, if you haven't muted from your console or your phone, that might be helpful. Just kind of keeps down some outside noise. So appreciate that. Thank you. Jason, back to y'all. Or it's Steve, I'm sorry. Esteban Ramos with the city.
Thank you, thank you. I want to touch on a little the project costs. I know people have been hearing different project costs, such as 1.3 billion. I want to ensure that this isn't correct. Project costs at the beginning of this whole entire endeavor, the cost of water at any cost wasn't an answer. One of the things for project costs that we were going through is that we started this project looking at siting and permitting. And we commonly call this the SWIFT loan first, or the first part. And that was for the 2.75 million that the city partnered with the Texas Water Development Board for a low interest deferred loan. And we'll be able to pay that off at the end or the beginning of the deferral. So it's almost like a no interest loan that we got into with the Texas Water Development Board. Very, very advantage to the city and other municipalities to utilize the state resources to better push forward in large projects such as this. The second SWIFT loan will be the development of a inner harbor plant that would be the 20 MGD expandable to 30 MGD. Projected cost for that loan would be 222 million. As you can see, we've broken it out into construction and non-construction costs for you. And there will be an operational and maintenance component or cost to that. And it's ranging in the 16 million annually. And this would produce the treated water, our potable water that can be entered into our distribution system. Again, leveraging the resources that the city has, or this area has, to provide water in times of drought and meet our cities and our region's future water demands. And again, I can't say it enough, the city of Corpus Christi has always looked at this project as how we can have little to no impact on our ratepayers, and we will continue to look at this. Next slide, please. So some funding, how are we going to pay for this, or what funding opportunities do we have to offset these costs? The region has looked at water supplies for a long time and been preparing through our Water Supply Development Fund, which is a fee that all of our customers pay. It's approximately 5 cents per thousand and brings in about $1.6 million a year, can be used to pay for debt service and other project needs for water supply development. In addition to that, at the beginning of this entire project, it's working with our customers, looking at what they need, preparing into the future, and making sure that this region, again, we learned from the 2011, 2013 drought. How can we prepare? How can we work together, working with our customers? The large volume users have voluntarily contributed 25 cents per thousand on their water utility bill. And that has been able to generate in a short time approximately $3 million a year. And again, working with, I know I sound like a broken record, but it's how large projects like this can be effective and financially responsible, is going out and obtaining low interest loans, using the abilities that the state of Texas provides to us. So going and getting the SWIFT loan, our state water implementation fund for Texas loan, provides us with some subsidies and a long-term loan opportunity, such as 30-year terms. Next slide, please. So I want to end kind of project costs, or cost for treated water. We're looking at a range between $3.50 and maybe $4 or $4.50 per thousand. This does have includes some contingencies, and we keep on refining the cost. And currently, I'm working with our director of finance and internally within the utility department and at the executive level to make sure that we're costing this project correctly and how will it integrate into our rate structure. And so as we keep on working with Freeze and Nichols and honing in on the cost for the project, the cost per consumer, our customer, will get finer and finer. Thank you, Jason. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Steve. And we're showing raise hand here, but I don't know if that option is available in this Zoom meeting. We've been doing these via Zoom webinar where there's a raise hand option, but I think that attendees actually have the ability to unmute themselves. So if all 71 don't talk at once, we'd be happy to entertain some questions. Leah?
Okay, so I want to just mention that I'm getting some comments back, some privately. I should have mentioned we will distribute this presentation out, package it along with the attendees and any key questions that we get, and we'll get that back to Jenny and get it out. Somebody asked about the municipal customers, how much they're currently charged. You can look at that. It depends on how much you use. If you go to the City of Corpus Christi and just type water department, there's a whole list of what different classes of customers now pay. So that's kind of a complicated answer, but it also, by the way, has raw water cost and what people are charged for that. I should also mention that I wanted to emphasize a couple of things based on some private tests. So when we say 20 going to 30, I want to emphasize that that means that the plant for $222 million that's envisioned would have the infrastructure in terms of intake and discharge already in it to allow to go to 30 MGD. So the incremental cost for the next 10 million will be considerably less than the 220 per 1,000 gallons. The other thing I was asked, Jason, could you go back and just restate that salinity slide and show that to people again? There are some people that want to see that again. This is the graph that shows increases both with inflows and without, please. Thank you. You want to talk about that just one more time, because that seems to be an interest to some.
I can, and this is, like I said, this graph looks very simple, but the model behind it is relatively complex. So for the purposes of simplifying it even further and being more conservative, if you just ignore the red line and assume that none of the water that's consumed from the desal plant is treated and returned to the base system, so the only thing that's returned would be the concentrate, that would be associated with this blue line. So, you know, technically, and I know there's a lot of technical folks on the line here, technically the independent variable is actually on the Y and the dependent is here on the X. So if in your mind you can reverse those, it's maybe a little bit easier. But if you take a look at production capacity, so if we're just looking at the Inner Harbor plant, which will be the first one to be procured and implemented, initially that's going to be at 20 MGD, but we'll look at the ultimate capacity here at 30 MGD, and you take that across to the intersection with the blue line. What that says is the model is showing that at 30 million gallons a day of desal production, you know, at which point we would be taking in about 70 to 80 million gallons a day of raw water, producing about 30 million gallons a day of potable water, and returning between 40 and 50,000 million gallons a day of concentrate. The long-term accumulation or potential increase in base salinity, and like I said, this model is not run for one day to see the impact or 1 year to see the impact. We run the model out until it reaches a steady state, which means this system stabilizes, and that shows a 0.3 of a part per thousand increase in the base system. We understand that any increase has to be taken seriously, and that's why we've had Dave Buzan and his team working so diligently to make sure that this project is sustainable, every aspect of the project. But this particularly, when compared to the natural range of salinities in our bays and the salinity tolerances for all stages of life for the species that are very important locally, commercially, recreationally, and for tourism, really the whole economy and the ecosystem, that this is well within the tolerances as well as the natural variations of salinity in the bay. Now, if you do include return flows, the model gets a little more complex because the capture rate isn't quite 100%. But then you see a dramatic reduction in that steady state accumulation of salinity. At 30 mgd, you really just see about a tenth of a part per thousand. So that's 1/10 relative to the natural swings, which would be about 16. So 0.1 versus 16. And so that's really what this chart's trying to show. We spun our wheels trying to figure out a way to communicate this well, and I hope we did a little bit. But if anyone has additional questions about this or the modeling that goes on in the background with the inflows, the tidal exchange, the outflows, and those things, we'd be happy to have that conversation or follow up with you.
Okay, just let me reinforce here. I got a message. How can we obtain a copy of this presentation? It's very informative. Again, Jenny will be sending it out so that to everybody on the list, or you can contact her if you don't get it. We have to kind of reduce it and put it into PDF form. So, Steve, do you want to talk just a second? Because we used the $222 million figure, but it's really broken up into two parts. So there is an off-ramp. Obviously, the idea will be to go out to select a private company to design, to do detailed designs and to construct the plant. But yeah, you might want to talk about that break, because there's another off-ramp. I mean, one of the things this project has been designed to do, and Bob and some others may want to jump in here, is to continuously reduce risk of the unknown, cost escalation, all those kinds of things. So this is an example of the methodical risk reduction approach that the city has used.
Steve, can I interrupt just for a second? Before we get too far away, this is Jim Tolan from Parks and Wildlife. Before we get too far away from that salinity graph, I had two questions about it.
Sure. Sorry, Jim. Go.
Okay. When you say far field, are you talking 400 feet away from the discharge? Or are you talking all the way across the bay on the backside of Mustang Island? This is going to be your expected salinity increase. Because far field means very something different when you talk about near field and far field as it relates to the diffuser. Or are you talking about the entire bay?
This would be relative to the entire bay.
Okay.
The way that we've looked at near field is those 3 mixing zones out to 400 feet. But the far field model that we're using is based on that 282 billion gallon volume of the bay, and then the dynamics that I showed with evaporation, precipitation, inflow and outflow. Yeah, so this is the entire bay.
Okay. Has the same sort of approach been taken to those 3 mixing zones to see what that salinity increase is expected to be?
Actually, the near field model is more detailed and much more dynamic, because it includes the velocity gradients from the jet diffusers. It includes all of that 6 months of ADCP data with ambient velocities. So that's actually the core mix model, the TCAQ approved core mix model that we're using for near field in those 50, 200, and 400 foot mixing zones. The modeling for that, Jim, is not 100% finalized. We're just plugging in that final ADCP data on La Quinta Channel. We're working on finishing up the ADCP surveys on the Inner Harbor. But we have submitted, as part of the permit application to the state, a white paper that was developed to help define the critical dilutions for those 3 zones. And then that's going to be the target for the design of the jet diffusion system. So we do have percentages of salinity increases across those 3 zones. That final modeling report has not been completed and provided to the state. However, we did provide a white paper that we'd be happy to share. I think Steve's team is talking about being able to put that together and share that before the state does. I know it's in technical review right now, but it's a really interesting look at what we call critical dilutions for those 3 near field mixing zones.
Well, thank you. And that leads me to my second question. This particular far field, the entire bay modeling, has that been published, or is it available for review? I'd love to take a look at it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. It hasn't been published yet. The modeling team that we're working with is Dr. To at Plummer, and then one of his colleagues, Dr. Fang, also at Plummer. And so I think that model is still in the works. I'm sure it's something they'd be happy to talk about, something both of those gentlemen are very passionate about. When that is available, or when they've got it to the point that they'd like to share it, we would like Parks and Wildlife's feedback on it.
Okay, anybody else have any questions or comments? I just want to re-emphasize too that the city has a specific webpage. It's called, if you just Google City of Corpus Christi seawater desalination, you will find lots and lots of history on this project, presentations that have been given over the many years on this project, as well as all kinds of, both of the permits in full are on that website, and Steve and his group are continuously adding new things.
And there's some
Leah, right before Jim jumped in, I think Steve was going to talk about project risk and how that's been kind of the foundation of approaching this.
Good point. Thank you.
Exactly. On the website, we're updating it all the time. And again, frequently asked questions are on there. I would point you to that. It's a good resource. Talking about risk, talking about this project as a whole. I mean, I've never been a part of a project that has been so vetted. I mean, it's been out in the public. We've been working with our customers, and I know I've said it more and more through this presentation. The whole idea was to look at how it would be beneficial to the entire region and how we can lower our risks and what we needed to do, and going out to the Texas Water Development Board and talking to them about the SWIFT program and what it could offer. We learned a lot of different things. And in this particular $222 million, we were able to break it up into a multi-year loan opportunity, where in the first part we would take a loan for approximately $11 million to move forward, and then in the next year we would go into the $220 million that would be a part of the development, or looking at getting a design, build, operate, going into procurement phase. So leveraging what the state can offer us with the subsidies and the multi-year commitment, and how we can lower our risks at every single point along this entire process was extremely beneficial to this entire endeavor to make it a part of the community and region project. I hope that answered the question, Leah.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, I just want to know that I like people to know, and the council knows that there are go, no go points throughout this project, and always have been. So anybody else want to say anything? Questions?
Thanks to Chris here for sharing the website link. If the attendees will look in the chat box, Chris has shared the website link to that desal page. And I'll add a little bit, Leah, on the risk side, because that's been something that's just been fascinating and integral to the project since 2014, is that the city has been very, very wise in taking on the risks that make sense to make the project more efficient, both from a schedule perspective and a cost perspective, but then also to be able to protect their interest in water supply. So, you know, for instance, in evaluating alternative water supplies, one of the attractive things about seawater desalination is that the city would own the water right. Another aspect of it is that it's very, very drought proof, I would say, drought resilient or drought proof. And it's a local supply that can be developed, as we've shown, very sustainably. The other thing that the city's done that takes on some risk initially would be going forward with the permits. We've seen in the development of other seawater desalination plants around the U.S. that permitting risk has been transferred to the private sector. And I think everyone on the United Chamber call here would understand the private sector considers risks at a cost. So the private sector would price that risk for permitting. The city's taken the approach that they can do a lot of this project development on their own in the early stages to be able to implement the project very efficiently, and also to be able to bring on this supply relatively quickly in the case that we do run into a drought, or like Steve talked about earlier, we see these prospective demand increases that would hit that 75% threshold.
Okay, so are we, other than people wanting copies of the presentation, and again, thanking Chris for doing what I should have done, which is send it out. I just say I can turn it back. Does anybody else have their hand raised? Does anybody want to unmute? And yeah, we don't have hand raised. So does anybody else want to unmute and comment? If not, I'll turn it back over to John LaRue and the Chamber and Jenny, and thank you very much for having us here, and thank you very much for everybody coming. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Leah, and thanks to Fries and Nichols and to the city for it was really excellent presentation, and I think the comments that you received were in line with that. I just want to thank everybody that got on the call this morning. We had over 70 people, which is great for our infrastructure committee. And if any of you on the call have any suggestions of topics you'd like us to consider at this meeting, please get in touch with Jenny or myself, and we'll get them to the committee. Our chair of the infrastructure committee is Eric Villarreal. Eric couldn't be with us this morning, but we really look forward to more conversations like this and to getting more and more of our community involved so that they know what's going to happen and what's going on. And the information provided, as I said, to someone that's not a scientist and grapples with some of this was excellent. You brought it down to a level that I could understand, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Ginny, do you have any wrap up?
No, I was just going to say that, yes, if you have suggestions for a topic for this group in the future, please email me, and I put my email address in the chat. And just one quick housekeeping item. I'm going to delete the calendar invite for this because sometimes if somebody declines it, it sends a cancellation notice to everyone and it's confusing. So that doesn't mean that we're canceling infrastructure committee. It just means that you are responsible for putting it on your own calendar. So that's all I have. And thanks everybody for being on this call today.
Thank you. Everybody have a great weekend. Stay safe, stay inside.